There's a set of rules governing every ANPR camera in every private car park in this country that most drivers have never actually read, and thousands are being fined right now for contraventions that, under the current code, technically shouldn't be enforceable at all. Let's get into exactly what these cameras are legally allowed to catch, what protections you actually have that most people don't use, and where the genuinely serious deadline sits for the industry itself. Start with what changed the entire foundation of how private car parks operate, because this is the shift that everything else in this video sits on top of. For years, two separate industry bodies, the British Parking Association and the International Parking Community, ran their own competing codes of practice, with slightly different rules depending on which operator's signage you happen to be parked under. That ended when a single, unified code of practice was published, jointly created by both bodies, applying the same baseline rules across effectively the entire private parking industry, regardless of which company owns the car park you're using. If you've ever wondered why the rules seem to shift depending on whether you are at a supermarket, a hospital, or a retail park, that inconsistency is exactly what this was designed to fix. Here's the part that actually matters at the moment your car rolls through the entrance and an ANPR camera reads your plate. Under the current code, you're legally entitled to what's called a consideration period, a minimum of 5 minutes from the moment you arrive, during which no charge can be issued at all. This exists specifically so you have time to actually read the signage, work out the terms, and decide whether you want to stay, before the clock on any potential charge even starts. If you drive in, glance around, decide the car park isn't right for you, and leave within that 5-minute window, no camera reading of your plate on the way in should ever turn into a charge landing on your doormat. The second protection is arguably more useful day to day, and it's the one catching operators out the most in complaints right now. A mandatory 10-minute grace period applies after the expiry of any paid-for or free parking period. Pay for an hour, get delayed by 5 minutes finishing up whatever you're actually doing, and under the code, that overrun sits inside a protected window where a charge still shouldn't be issued. This has genuinely been part of both the old BPA and IPC codes for a while, but it's now baked into a single, harder-to-dispute standard, rather than depending on which operator's version of the rules happen to apply to the specific car park you used. Now here's where thousands of drivers are actually losing money, despite these protections existing on paper. A huge number of charges get issued and paid without the driver ever checking whether the timing genuinely falls outside these windows. Operators aren't required to proactively remind you these grace periods exist, and a lot of automated ANPR systems will flag an overstay the second the clock ticks over the paid time, regardless of whether the 10-minute grace period has technically been respected in how the charge gets processed downstream. If you've ever paid a charge you privately felt was unfair, checking the exact timestamps on the notice against these two windows is worth doing before you assume there's nothing you can do about it. Let's talk about what the cameras themselves are actually allowed to capture, because this is a detail almost nobody knows, and it's directly relevant to the word camera in this whole conversation. The code is explicit that photographic evidence from ANPR and camera systems can only be used to issue a charge in relation to vehicles that are genuinely parked, not vehicles whose drivers have simply paused briefly, for example while checking directions or waiting to pick someone up at a drop-off point. A vehicle is considered parked under the code's own definition, whether or not the driver has actually left it or turned off the engine once the consideration period has expired. But a momentary stop that never becomes a genuine parking event isn't supposed to generate a valid charge in the first place, even if the ANPR system logged your plate during that window. On the financial side, here's what the code actually caps things at right now. Parking charges are not permitted to exceed £100. If you pay within 14 days of the notice being issued, whether that's a notice put on your windscreen at the time or one posted to you afterward as the registered keeper, operators must offer a minimum 40% discount, bringing a full charge down considerably if you act quickly rather than ignoring it. Let it go unpaid and escalate, and up to an additional £60 in debt recovery costs can be added on top, which is exactly how a charge that started at £60 discounted can balloon toward triple that figure if it's left to drift through the enforcement and debt recovery process. There's also a rule worth knowing if you've ever received more than one charge for what feels like the same continuous stay. Operators are not permitted to issue more than one parking charge in the same calendar day for the same parking event under their advertised terms. If you've been hit with what looks like duplicate or stacked charges covering what was genuinely one uninterrupted stay, that's grounds to challenge it directly rather than assuming each notice needs to be dealt with and paid separately. Signage is where a lot of successful appeals actually come from, and it's worth understanding why. The code requires signs to be visible, legible, and unambiguous, with specific requirements now covering text size, contrast, and placement at eye level at every entry point, not just somewhere on the boundary fence you'd need to actively search for. If an entrance sign was obscured by overgrown vegetation, poorly lit at night, or simply too small to reasonably read from a moving vehicle, that's a legitimate basis to challenge a charge, because you genuinely weren't given a fair chance to understand the terms you were supposedly agreeing to by parking there. If your appeal against a private operator does get rejected, and you still believe the charge was wrong, there's now a single appeals service replacing the two separate, sometimes inconsistent systems that used to exist, depending on which trade body the operator belonged to. Operators are required to accept whatever determination that appeals service reaches, which is a meaningfully stronger protection than the old setup, where appeal outcomes could feel like they depended heavily on which specific scheme you happen to be dealing with. It's worth understanding where the operator actually gets your details from in the first place, because this is a step people rarely think about until a letter arrives at their home address weeks after the event. If you don't pay at the barrier or on exit, and the charge instead gets posted to you as the registered keeper, the operator has requested your name and address directly from the DVLA Vehicle Keeper Register. That access isn't automatic or unrestricted. It's only granted to operators who are registered with an accredited trade association. And that accreditation itself is something the DVLA can withdraw if an operator consistently breaches the code. If you've ever wondered how a car park you've never given your details to somehow knows exactly where to send a bill, that's the mechanism. And it's also exactly why staying compliant with the code actually matters commercially to operators. Losing DVLA access cuts off their entire enforcement route. There's also a protection worth knowing about if your circumstances around a specific parking event were genuinely unusual. The code requires operators to have a documented process for considering exceptional circumstances, medical emergencies, genuine vehicle breakdowns, or situations where a driver couldn't reasonably have complied with the terms through no fault of their own. This isn't a blanket excuse clause, and operators aren't required to accept every explanation offered. But if something genuinely out of the ordinary happened during your stay, that circumstance is supposed to be considered properly rather than dismissed automatically by an algorithm that only sees a timestamp mismatch. Now for the piece that ties directly into why cameras and enforcement have become such a hot topic this year specifically. The code sets out a genuine transition timeline for the entire industry, and the deadline that matters most sits at the end of this year. New sites and specific obligations like all new self-ticketing registration and reporting requirements have already needed to be compliant since October 2024. But by the 31st of December this year, every single aspect of the code must be complied with, across every existing site, with no further transition allowances remaining. That's the genuinely significant date behind all of this, the point at which the entire private parking industry, not just newly opened sites, has to be fully aligned with consideration periods, grace periods, charge caps, and signage standards, with nowhere left to claim they're still transitioning. It's worth being honest about where the real teeth still sit, though, because there's an important distinction between this industry-created code and the government's own long-promised private parking code of practice, which was previously introduced and then withdrawn back in 2022, and is still, at the time of writing, awaited in an updated form. Motoring groups have been fairly blunt that this single-sector code, while a genuine improvement, falls short of what a legally backed government code would deliver, including firmer sanctions against operators who repeatedly break the rules. So while what we've covered today is real and enforceable through the trade associations and their accredited status with the DVLA, it's worth knowing this isn't necessarily the final word on parking reform in this country. So let's pull this together into something you can actually use next time you're parking somewhere unfamiliar. You have a genuine 5-minute window to read the signage and decide whether to stay before any charge clock starts. You have a 10-minute grace period after your paid time expires before an overstay charge should apply. Camera evidence is only supposed to generate a charge for a genuinely parked vehicle, not a momentary stop. Charges are capped at £100, with a mandatory 40% discount for paying within 14 days. Operators can't stack multiple charges for the same continuous stay. And if signage was unclear, poorly placed, or hard to read, that's a legitimate basis to challenge, rather than simply pay and move on. It's also worth touching on where enforcement might tighten further from here, because the direction of travel across this entire sector points toward more scrutiny, not less. A government consultation has separately been looking at whether the current £100 cap itself should come down further, with figures like £50 outside London and £80 for more serious contraventions, such as disabled bay misuse, being discussed as possibilities, alongside an £80 and £130 structure specifically for London. None of that is confirmed law yet. The consultation results are still working their way through review, with any actual change expected sometime in late 2026 or into 2027 at the earliest. But if you're the kind of driver who occasionally gets caught out by parking charges, it's worth watching for that outcome specifically, because a confirmed reduction in the cap itself would be a much bigger practical win than anything covered in the code we've already discussed today. Practically speaking, here's what I'd actually do differently starting with your next car park visit. Note the time you actually arrive, not just when you think you parked, because that consideration period protection only works if you know your own starting point. If you're running slightly over a paid period, check whether you're genuinely still inside the 10-minute grace window before assuming a charge is inevitable. And if a charge does land on your doormat weeks later, check the timestamps against both of these windows before simply paying it to make the letters stop. Because a meaningful number of these charges genuinely don't hold up once you look closely at exactly when the clock should have started. None of this means every charge you've ever received was wrong. Most genuinely aren't. And plenty of drivers do simply overstay or ignore clearly displayed terms. But a meaningful number of charges are being issued and quietly paid despite falling inside these protected windows, purely because most people don't know the windows exist. If this helped you understand exactly what these cameras are and aren't allowed to catch you for, hit subscribe, because the full industry compliance deadline lands at the end of this year, and there's a real chance the charge cap itself comes down further not long after. I'll be covering both the moment there's confirmed movement on either front. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.